Cough. Mike Joseph took out his handkerchief, covered his mouth, and coughed several times. The smog in the factory district was thicker than anywhere else. The air was gray with a yellowish tint, as though it was floating dust. Occasionally a pungent, suffocating odor that even Mr. Reporter, who was long used to the backland air, could not bear. He turned to Klein, who was also coughing softly. He have always been a huge supporter of the government's establishment of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council and the Alkaline Industry Inspector, but only today did I learn that the problem has become so serious. If we don't take effective measures, it may become a tragedy in the future. Klein tried hard to clear his blocked nose. Perhaps the whole of Backland would be shrouded in smog that results in one's vision not exceeding 5 meters, and it's possible that an evil god would descend or be born in such a backdrop, he added silently. Old Kohler didn't quite understand the conversation. He cleared his throat that was filled with thick phlegm and led the reporter and the detective around the watchman and into a lead factory. Most of the workers were women. They were working busily without any protection, and the factory floor was filled with dust. Looking at the tiny particles floating in the air, Klein felt like he was looking at toxic gas. The young ladies without masks were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. For a moment, he felt as though he was back in Tingen, back to the time when he had helped Sir Deweyville deal with the grievance haunting him. He seemed to have already witnessed the future of each and every female worker, some of them with throbbing heads, some with blurred vision, some turning hysterical, some with gums with a blue line, and finally, they either went blind or fell dead. It's like a large-scale, bloody sacrificial ritual. The only difference is that the target is that flashing symbol of money. If the Aurora Order, Rose School of Thought, and other evil sects could make good use of similar situations, just like what Lanevis did, there would be a huge problem. Klein covered his mouth and nose as he quietly watched. Mike Joseph muttered in surprise and anger, "How can this be? How can they be like this?" A while ago, all sorts of newspapers and magazines were focused on the issue of lead poisoning. Why aren't they using any precautionary measures at all? They can't even bear to use a mask. These factory owners are murderers. He truly is a reporter with a sense of righteousness. Even though he isn't young, he's rather stingy, and his acting is pretty outstanding. He still retains his original pure motives, but how is he so aware of lead poisoning? Right, I forgot. I had gotten Sir Deweyville to advertise the dangers of lead poisoning on the newspapers and magazines. It seems like he did it well. But for some people, what does it matter if 1 or 2 of the lower-class commoners die? There are plenty of people waiting for jobs. Klein thought with a heavy heart. As a senior journalist, Mike didn't lose his reason. He quietly observed and asked a few workers who had changed shifts, then he left the lead factory. Subsequently, they entered one factory after another, but lost their mood to discuss anything when they saw the squalor of the place and the intensive labor involved. It was almost noon when Klein suddenly discovered that there were a lot of people gathered outside a factory. They were mostly women, and they were excitedly shouting something and were trying to rush in. What happened? Mike asked Old Kohler, puzzled. Old Kohler was also puzzled. TL, go over and ask. He jogged to the outside of the factory and blended into the crowd. It took him several minutes to get back to Klein and Mike. They're going to smash those new machines. Old Kohler took a breath and got to the point. Why? Mike hadn't been in charge of similar news before, and so he didn't know much about the situation. As for Klein, he had an inkling of the reason. Old Kohler pointed to the factory and said, "This is a textile factory. They wish to use the latest textile machine, so the number of people in charge of controlling the machines needed will decrease. It seems like they're going to fire a third of the workers. The female workers want to smash the machines and get their jobs back, or else they'll probably not survive. Perhaps the only choice is for them to become street girls." Mike opened his mouth. From the shape of his mouth, he looked like he was going to say fools, but he didn't say anything in the end. He just looked in silence and didn't even move closer. Let's go back. We pretty much finished my investigative interview. After a long time, Mike sighed. All 3 of them turned around and began to walk out of the factory district. No one spoke as they walked. As they were about to part, Mike glanced at Klein and spoke in a low voice. Do you think those women can still find anything else to do if the lead factories who do not provide protection are shut down, or if their bosses are sent to court? Klein gave it some serious thought and said, if it's just a few factories, there won't be much of a problem, but some female workers might suffer from the hunger and cold while looking for other jobs, and they would gradually lose their strength because they don't have any saving. TT would be a disaster if too many factories are shut down in a short period of time, not to mention the people who lose their jobs after the new textile machines are used. The Backland factory district alone might have thousands or even tens of thousands of unemployed workers who have no food or clothing, roaming the streets like zombies. They might lower the conditions of their pay in order to snatch the jobs of others. Who knows how many people in East Borough will lead an even more difficult life or die as a result. It would be a hell-like scene, and even if this world doesn't have Beyonder powers, it would still bring about a huge disaster. And now the various evil gods are lurking in the darkness, waiting. Klein swallowed all the words in his mind. Mike fell silent again, and after paying £10 and 6 solely, he left the smoke-emitting factory district in a carriage. Klein looked at the carriage ride into the distance, but didn't say anything. Back when he was a Nighthawk, he had known and come into contact with the lives of the poor, but the impression left on him wasn't as deep this time. A multi-dimensional observation revealed a human abyss in front of his eye. East Borough is truly filled with hidden dangers and Tinder-like threats. If one isn't careful, it can be ignited by a cult. Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, "Kohler, I'd like to ask you to help me keep an eye on the situation in East Borough." "Oh, only when you're not bogged down by work. TLL pay you, giving you the money to build a relationship with the other workers. Every week, we will set a time to meet at the coffee shop from before." Old Kohler's eyes lit up. "No problem." He made no mention of the price, and he fully trusted the good detective. Klein weighed his options and said, "Every time we meet, I'll give you 15 solely as funds and compensation. If you provide me with information that I'm satisfied with, there will also be an additional 5 solely as payment." "A pound?" Old Kohler blurted out in shock. In his warmest and happiest days, he was paid only 21 solely a week, or £1 1 solely. "Yes." Klein nodded. "You have to pay attention to your words and action. Don't be in a hurry to gather information. Maintain a state of speaking less and listening more. Otherwise, you'll be in danger. Informant fees such as these can theoretically be reimbursed, but I'm now a self-sponsored 50p party one." Klein sighed as he gave a self-deprecating laugh. Empress Borough, in Miss Audrey's study within Count Hall's luxurious villa. The blonde was listening to Miss Escalante, her psychology teacher, as she occasionally stroked Susie, the big dog who was sitting beside her. With dark hair that went all the way down to her waist, Escalante Oslika noticed that the dog also seemed to be listening intently. She couldn't help but smile and pause for 2 seconds. Following that, she continued with her introduction. There are currently no completely orthodox theories in the field of psychology. There are several schools of thought, such as psychoanalysis, personality analysis, and behavioral psychology. Of course, research on the mind is not only performed by psychologists and psychiatrists. Many professionals in the field of mysticism are also doing similar work. Among them, the most famous one is, sorry, I've deviated from the curriculum. Let's return to the topic just now and talk about psychoanalysis. Audrey could clearly notice Escalante's intention to guide the topic, therefore. She feigned ignorance and asked curiously, "Teacher, I'd like to know more about the research situation for the mind in the field of mysticism. As you know, I'm very interested in that." Escalante pursed her lips, frowned, and said in embarrassment, "But there are vows of secrecy. I mean, these theories and research are part of the secrets of the mysticism circle. They're privy to those on the inside." "Yes, that's so. Then can I join?" Audrey asked expectantly. "They aren't involved in anything evil, right?" "Hi, how is that possible?" "It's just a seminar organized by enthusiasts." Escalante diverted the topic after mentioning it. "Let's talk about this later. Let's continue with the lesson first. I've got to know where to draw the line. I'll do it one step at a time. If this is the general trait of the members of the Psychology Alchemists, then I don't have to worry too much about it being filled with lunatics and perverts like Mr. A." Audrey deliberately put on an expression of reluctance when skipping the subject, but she still politely listened to the theoretical foundations of psychoanalysis. When the class was over and after sending Escalante off, she returned to the study, carefully closed the heavy wooden door, and said to the huge golden retriever, "Susie, what do you think of her?" "She's not sincere," Susie answered flatly. Then she tilted her head and said, "However, what she said is very interesting." I think it's even more interesting than meat and biscuits. Susie, do you wish to be a psychiatrist in the future, specializing in the treatment of mental illness in animals? For example, that horse which is suspected to suffer from depression at the Glanes. Audrey suddenly fell into deep thought, wondering if she should prepare a special white coat and gold-rimmed glasses for Susie to look a little more professional. Banquet. When he got back to Mint Street from the factory district, Klein had a simple lunch and took a nap. He didn't wake up until the evening when the sky had darkened. But even so, he still felt exhausted, exhaustion that stemmed from the depths of his heart. After quite some time of being lost in thought, Klein went down to the first floor and lit the gas lamp. He prepared to sit on the sofa and read the day's newspapers, but when he glanced around, he saw an invitation letter on the coffee table. He was stunned for a moment before realizing that it was an invitation letter, which Mrs. Stellan Sammer had sent her maidservant to deliver a few days ago. I almost forgot about this. The disguised matchmaking banquet. Klein put down the invitation letter and walked to the bathroom on the first floor. He used cold water to wash his face, sprucing himself up to look much more energetic. Compared to when he first arrived at Backlund, there was a much thicker black stubble around his lips and under his chin. Although it didn't completely eliminate his scholarly bearing, it made him look more mature and rugged. Someone who doesn't really know me well wouldn't be able to recognize me in person. Klein exhaled silently, wiped his face clean, and put his gold-rimmed glasses on the bridge of his nose. He took a short break, changed into a shirt with a starched collar and a black tailcoat, and then, quite formally, he put on his silk half-top hat and picked up his cane stick and invitation letter before leaving the house for the unit beside his. Midst the tinkling of the doorbell, he saw Julian, the maidservant, open the door and Stellan with her blonde hair coiled up high, and her ears adorned with silver earrings. Klein took off his hat, bowed, and praised politely, "Mrs. Sammer, you are very beautiful today." Although his words were extremely perfunctory, it was true that she was much more beautiful than usual. It appeared that her ability to doll herself up meticulously had experienced a significant breakthrough. It seems like the adultery case made her besties with Ma'am Mary. Besides, Mary is now a tycoon with a wealth of tens of thousands of pounds, and she has been admitted into the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, allowing her to acquaint herself with many people in power. She must have had sufficient experience in the areas of makeup, clothing, accessories, and so on. Klein nodded in understanding. The corners of Stellan's mouth couldn't help but curl up. "These are my new earrings that cost 8 solid. Lady, you haven't changed in the slightest." Klein smiled and handed his hat, cane, and coat to the maidservant. The fireplace and the pipes in the room brought the warmth of early summer. Many women and young ladies were not dressed that conservatively. Some of their fair arms were exposed, while others bared their creamy chests. "Luke is talking business with some friends. Let me apologize on his behalf." Stellan played her role as the female host to its fullest. "Have your meal first. I'll introduce you to a few well-educated ladies later." "Actually, there's no need for that. Just let me eat in peace," Klein smiled. He can already smell the fragrance of the food. Since there were quite a lot of guests, with over 20 of them, the dinner was in the form of a buffet. Klein took a plate and walked around, and he found that the food was a lot more varied than before. Cold trout chicken pie, mutton stew with peas, salted breast, curry, roast beef, turkey, beef tongue pastry, ham, salad, and cream cake. The alcohol provided was still champagne and red wine. This suited a carnivore's palate very well. Klein, with his large plate, didn't make conversation with anyone. He hid in a corner and slowly savored the food. It's not as good as the chefs at the Kellogg Club. From time to time, he would inwardly make comments on the food. He was about to go for second helping when he was finally discovered by Stellan Sammer. At the same time, he saw an acquaintance beside the lady. It was none other than Lawyer Jurgen with his serious expression. "Right, Jurgen is also a bachelor." Klein smiled and walked over, taking the initiative to ask, "How is Mrs. Doris's recovery?" Jurgen uncomfortably tugged at his bow tie. "She'll be discharged next week." "That's great," Klein sincerely said with mixed emotion. At that moment, Stellan had already brought a few young ladies over and introduced them. "This is Mr. Jurgen Cooper, a senior solicitor, who earns at least £3 a week. He often gets a commission from the cases he handles, and he definitely earns more than £200 a year. Furthermore, he is young and capable. He will most likely become a great lawyer in the future. This is Mr. Sherlock Moriarty, a well-known detective." His income is unstable, but he is paid handsomely for every mission he receives, for example 10 or 50 pounds. Lady, isn't this too direct? Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon. Jurgen, who was standing beside him, evidently frowned. Without feeling that she had made a faux pas, Stellan continued the introductions. Miss Sarah Taylor. Her parents are teachers at a grammar school, Miss Angelina Watson. Her father is a civil servant at the Backland Police Department. Klein smiled numbly and greeted each lady. After Stellan was done, Jurgen said in a deep voice, Mrs. Sammer, it's impolite to mention the income of others in front of others. Stellan wasn't mad. Instead, she replied very seriously, no, it's very important. TF, you end up liking each other and decide to start a family, then income is essential. Think about it, there must be meat, vegetables, fruits, milk, white bread, butter, cream, and other foods every day. It costs at least £1.05 solely a week on food alone, not to mention the alcohol. In addition, to rent a better house is nearly £1 a week. Yes, there's also the need to purchase water, gas, charcoal, soap, and the like. One still needs to consider transportation expenses. This adds up to about 10 solely. That is just the most fundamental expenses. Are you not bringing your wife to a musical concert or to go watch a play? Don't you need to get new clothes every year? Ladies, I believe that a family must spend at least £30 a year on it in order to be considered to be living a decent life. In addition, there is the salary of the maid, the cost of education for any children, the emergency money that's needed to be set aside for medical treatment, as well as the expenditure of some necessary decoration. Only with an income of more than £200 a year can those needs be met. Only then can a happy family be achieved. Thus, in order to not delay everyone's time or cause any misunderstandings, I believe it is necessary to include this in the introduction. As a lawyer, Jurgen was momentarily unable to provide a rejoinder. Fortunately, he always had a serious and stern expression on his face. How big-hearted, but the basic etiquette is to tell the two parties this information in private. And of course, I know exactly why you're making the introduction straight to their face, Klein smiled. Yes, income is very important. Only with an income of more than £400 a year can one host a dinner at this level. Only with that much can one afford to have his wife be dressed in beautiful dresses and exquisite earrings. Stellan raised her chin slightly as she tried her best to suppress her smile and said, £430. I mean that there must be some savings each year to prevent any accidents or to have spare cash to invest into stocks or bonds. That was her husband's approximate annual income. After finding a common topic for the two groups of strangers, she left and greeted the other guests. Klein could also clearly sense that Sarah, Angelina, and the other ladies were more interested in lawyer Jurgen. After all, he was a good-looking man, and his job and income were very stable. As for a private detective who might be locked up in the police station at any time, they were not the first choice for middle-class women. Besides, Klein now looked rugged with his beard. It wasn't a surprise that the girls would remain a little apprehensive towards him. After a short casual chat with them, he found an excuse to leave before hiding in a corner and eating while he enjoyed watching Jurgen's awkward and helpless performance. At this moment, it was a wonder where his eloquence as a lawyer had gone to. A few minutes later, the two children of the Sammers ran past Klein while playing. They noticed the gentleman in the corner, stopped, and with widened eyes asked curiously, Mr. Moriarty, we heard that you're a detective. Yes. Klein smiled in response. The little girl said innocently, can you tell us about the cases you've cracked? Her twin brother nodded immediately. The cases I cracked. If it doesn't involve wraiths, puppets, or devil dogs, then it's about finding cats or catching an adulterer. There's really nothing suitable for children, Klein thought for a few seconds, then chuckled. All right, this is a story about treasure. An officer who had just returned from East Balham was suddenly murdered. He had mostly forgotten the detective novels he had read in his previous life, so he could only make them up based on a vague impression. The two children didn't care about the irrationality of the plot and listened very seriously, even learning to ask, what happened next? Without realizing it, Klein was a lot more relaxed. When the banquet was almost over and he was about to leave, he saw that Stellan's face was filled with joy. What is the cause for celebration? Klein casually asked. Stellan raised her head slightly and replied with a reserved smile. Mary has received a luncheon invitation from the Chief Secretary of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, Mr. Hibbert Hall, on Monday. This gentleman is the eldest son of Count Hall, a true nobleman. He has invited all the members of the council and has allowed them to bring 2 or 3 friends with them. Stellan paused. Luke and I were just invited by Mary. Monday afternoon. Dressed to the nines, Stellan Sammer, who was accompanied by her husband Luke Sammer, followed Ma'am Mary to Empress Borough where they saw a large building. Marble statues, pools, fountains, gardens and lawns reflected themselves in her eyes, making her feel nervous even before she entered the villa. "Luke, does my necklace not match my dress?" she asked her husband as she tilted her head. Luke shook his head and laughed. "Darling, you're too nervous. You don't have to worry about that. The nobles only live in a place that's slightly bigger than ours and eat a little better. We aren't lacking in any way." Stellan nodded when she heard that, as though she had found her confidence. Entering the villa, they saw the gorgeous crystal chandelier, the hall which could accommodate many dancers, and the plates of delicious food. Foie gras, pan-fried dragon-bone fish, baked lobster, Almere grape wine, misty champagne. It's exactly the same as the magazine's description. Stellan looked at the food with curiosity, thinking that she could have such a meal on a holiday or during New Year's if they scrimped a little. Except for the Almere wine and the misty champagne, she finally added in her mind. At this moment, her gaze suddenly straightened. She saw a young girl wearing a beige palace dress walking over. The girl had blonde hair and green eyes, and she was abnormally beautiful. She wore a pair of white silk gloves with a pair of small, beautiful emerald earrings. She exuded pureness and elegance. "She's just like an angel," even though she had always been proud of her appearance. Stellan couldn't help but exclaim in admiration, and she felt an inexplicable sense of inferiority at that moment. "Hello," she clumsily greeted with the etiquette she had just learned. "Hello," the girl returned the greeting gracefully. After they had passed each other, Stellan accompanied her husband and Mary to meet the distinguished guests and the noble, Mr. Hibbert Hall. After a while she walked to the balcony by herself, intending to ease her mood. However, she unexpectedly saw the angelic girl from before. She was looking out over the landscape. A large golden retriever obediently sat beside her rose ribbon-rimmed shoe. "It's so cute." Stellan made an attempt to make conversation. The young girl replied with a faint smile, "Let me thank you on Susie's behalf for your praise." As she looked at the duo, Stellan suddenly felt that she should own a similar pet for herself. This was the only way to showcase the Sammers' dignity. She asked in a measured tone, "I heard that the nobles rear a lot of hunting hounds. Is this one of them?" "Yes." The girl, whose emerald green eyes looked more enchanting than her earrings gems, lightly nodded. "May I know how much money is needed to buy one?" Stellan asked with a smile. The pure and elegant girl looked down at the huge golden retriever and, without minding the question, answered with a slight smile, £450. On a luxurious carriage on their way, leaving Count Hall's villa, Luke was chatting with Ma'am Mary about the distinguished guests, such as the chairman of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council and chief of the National Weather Service, Sir Dare Shaw, or the council member of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council and president of the Royal Meteorological Society, House of Commons Member of Parliament, Mr. Cave, or Midseashire Medical Health's director in charge and renowned doctor, Mr. Hawkesley. They were all influential figures in the government and the royal family or parliament. And the council's final report would be the most important basis for the planned Anti-Pollution Act and Smoke Emission Act. The Coim Company, which specialized in anthracite and charcoal, was trying to promote and expedite the development, disrupting older but larger competitors from handling the changes. They will certainly not be stingy with their money, and will certainly lobby the heavyweight members of Parliament to interfere with our investigation. We must have a clear solution, just like what Mr. Hibbert Hall said. We need to take hold of public opinion and let the newspapers and magazines repeat the horrors of smoke pollution. Luke was a senior manager at Coim, a key assistant to Coim's major shareholder and person in control, Mary, and he himself was quite capable. As they chatted, Luke suddenly noticed that his wife was sitting next to him without saying a word, as if she had lost her soul. "Stellan, what happened?" Luke asked with concern. Stellan jolted back to her senses, forced a smile, and said, "Nothing, I'm just a little tired." "That's right. You must be extremely tense seeing so many important figures. Now you can finally relax. Exhaustion is a very normal thing. Actually, it's the same for me." Luke smiled. Stellan didn't respond. Instead, she looked out the window towards the park with a lake. Her ears were still ringing with the casual words, of the young noble girl from before. 450 pounds. A trained hound is priced between 450 and 700 pounds. City of Silver at the bottom of the spire. Derek Berg was locked in a small room, eating food and taking his medicine regularly. As a result, his mental state rapidly improved as his visual and auditory hallucinations were no longer present. I'll be able to leave in a day or two. It's really hard to stay locked up in such an environment for long periods of time. The former captain of the exploration team in the next cell has been locked up for 42 years, yet he's still very lucid and rational. If it were me, I definitely would have gone crazy, however. The explorations and strange monsters that he spoke of are rather attractive and even terrifying. Derek sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the candle that had burned to the end. Before the keepers delivered his next round of food and medicine, he would be placed in true darkness. At that moment, he saw a gray fog spread out as the deep voice of the fool sounded. Prepare for the gathering. Such a change was fleeting. Derek focused his attention and subconsciously counted his heartbeat. However, he soon realized that this wasn't necessary because his current state was one of solitude, and he didn't need to avoid others. Derek, who was no longer counting his heartbeats, quickly thought of a question. Would Mr. Fool's subsequent actions of pulling me above the gray fog be discovered and detected when I'm within the confines of the seal of the mystical object at the bottom of the spire? These were two mystical items that had prevented the complete destruction of the City of Silver in the face of several calamities. In his nervousness and uneasiness, Derek, who had been unable to come to a decision, saw endless dark red lights gushing out of the void and engulf him. The small enclosed room turned completely silent. Even the sound of his breathing had become extremely weak. Suddenly, the metal wall between Derek and the former exploration team's captain produced a tapping sound. This was the signal the two of them used if they wished to talk to each other. Taku. The other person bent his finger and knocked again. After that, what should have been a third tap that followed in succession didn't happen. After a long while, the tapping sound hesitantly rang out again. Following that, both rooms fell into silence, and not a single sound could be heard. After finishing her luncheon, Audrey practiced on the piano before returning to her bedroom while keeping track of the time. As she passed her father's study, she saw that the door was ajar, and a thick stack of papers lay on the table. Those weren't there before. Curious, Audrey slowed down and winked at Susie. As a spectator, Susie often needed only a small hint to understand what her mistress wanted her to do. Of course, she would also occasionally pretend that she didn't understand, only wishing to lie still. Susie, who had received the signal, trotted silently into the study, then stretched out her front paws, placed them on the edge of the table, and stood upright. She quickly glanced at the front page of the stack of documents, returned to Audrey's side, and said in a low voice, "Survey of living conditions at all levels in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district." Audrey, what do those words mean? Survey of living conditions at all levels in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district. Why did Dad suddenly commission this survey? I don't remember ever mentioning anything about this to him. Audrey was confused and didn't bother to answer Susie's question. She looked around, and seeing that the servants were at their stations and not paying particular attention to her, she raised her head slightly and calmly turned to enter Count Hall's study. At the desk, Audrey looked down at the report and saw that the title was exactly as Susie had described. Lumit's document typed by a typewriter. The investigator is a reporter named Mike Joseph. There's the goddess's sacred emblem at the bottom. Was this commissioned by the Church of the Goddess? But why is Father given a copy? Oh, Father is a believer of the goddess, and the church wants him to provide some support on this matter. That's a good thing. Audrey made a preliminary judgment. She had originally thought of hiring others to do a similar investigation, but she felt that this was not in accordance with her intention of guiding others behind the scenes. It was very easy to be noticed and no longer be ignored by the other nobles. Therefore, she had been hesitant. Audrey reached for the file and flipped through it. She found that Mike Joseph wasn't the only one reporting on East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district. There were also quite a few people who had made their own field investigations from different angles. Some of them even mentioned the proliferation of cults and how some Beyonders were colluding with the gang. Audrey looked at the clock in the study and saw that it was almost 3. She quickly gave up on reading the report carefully and returned the document to its original state. Before she left, she picked up a book and used it as a disguise for her purpose of entry. At 3 o'clock sharp, While the chiming of the hanging clock was still reverberating through the air, Audrey had already appeared inside the majestic palace via the dark red, illusory light, and found herself beside the ancient long table. She smiled, stood up, and bowed in the direction of the seat of honor. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool Tilda." Having received a light nod in response, she then respectively greeted the hanged man, the world, and company. She keenly noticed that the son seemed to be a little uneasy. "What are you worried about?" Audrey asked. This spared Klein's need to speak, having also noticed that little son didn't seem right. Entering this mysterious space ahead of time, he tidied the items on the table, tossing them into a corner along with Azek's copper whistle, the biological poison bottle, Numinous Episcopat's copper whistle, and other things. He had then covered them with a thick fog. Presently, there was only the Dark Emperor card on the table before him. This was an item that matched the identity of the fool. Derek didn't hide anything and immediately recounted his successful malingering and how he was sent to the bottom of the spire to be isolated for treatment. Finally, he asked, "Honorable Mr. Fool, will that mystical item detect my participation in the Tarot Club?" "How would I know? I don't even know what it is, however. There are currently no strange or powerful forces attempting to invade him. Even the eternal blazing sun and the true creator couldn't find this place." Klein tapped his finger on the edge of the long bronze table and replied in a relaxed manner. "Generally speaking, it wouldn't make any discovery. But some mystical items possess special effect." Seeing that Mr. Fool had given an affirmative answer, Derek was immediately relieved. He tersely gave acknowledgement and said, "I'm not sure of its special effects either. It's one of the City of Silver's top secrets." At this point, he suddenly thought of what the former captain of the exploration team had told him. He blurted out a question, "Have any of you heard of a person named Ammon?" "Ammon?" After a moment's thought, Klein remembered the source of the familiarity. But he didn't answer in a hurry. Instead, he looked at the hanged man, knowing full well that this middle-ranking member of the Church of the Lord of Storms also knew Ammon, and perhaps he knew even more than he did. Similarly, Audrey also looked at the hanged man. She had also heard the name from him the last time. Ors listened with a blank face, feeling that the things discussed here were always outside the scope of her knowledge. Alger frowned and asked in confusion, "You ran into a man who called himself Ammon while you were exploring the surrounding areas of the City of Silver. Or perhaps you discovered related records?" Derek nodded seriously and said, "Yes, 42 years ago, an exploratory team encountered a man claiming to be Ammon in the depths of the darkness. After they returned to the City of Silver, they lost control one after another. Only one of them was left, and he was imprisoned at the bottom of the spire in the cell next to me. Maybe he went mad too, and that was just a figment of his imagination." Fors, with a wealth of novel creation experience, postulated a guess. Alger glanced at Mr. Fool, who sat at the end of the table. Seeing him appear staid and without expressing anything, he boldly said, "Imagination is a possibility, but one shouldn't imagine the name Ammon for no reason." He turned his head to the sun and said, "In the fourth epoch, about 1500 years ago in the kingdom we live in, there was a family with strange powers. They belonged to the Tudor dynasty, and their surname was Ammon. Even in an era with numerous high-sequence Beyonders, the surname of the clan was taboo." Just as Audrey asked instead of the sun, "Why?" The hanged man, Alger, didn't answer her directly as he continued on. "Abraham, Antigonus, Ammon, Jacob, and Tamara are the 5 great families that supported the establishment of the Tudor dynasty, and they were second only to the Blood Emperor. Among them, the Ammon family is the most mysterious one. They have the least history left behind, and they seem to have been distorted and covered up by some kind of power. There was a piece of information that came from the king of the 5 seas, Nast. The Ammons are a family of blasphemers, and they wield the secrets to usurp the powers of deity. Also, the Ammon family call themselves the descendants of the ancient sun god." Derek Berg was left confused. In his knowledge of myths, there was no such thing as an ancient sun god. Among the 8 ancient deities, Giant King, Almir, Dragon of Imagination, Anquelt, Mutated King, Cave Aster, Elf King, Sonithrim, King of Demonic Wolves, Phlegria, Vampire Ancestor, Lilith, Phoenix Ancestor, Gregrace, and Devil Monarch, Farbody, none of them wielded the power of the sun. Derek seriously considered this problem. If I really need to make a connection, the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God, had shown powers in the sun domain. Could the Ammon family be his descendant? Noticing that Sun wasn't saying anything, Alger stroked the stubble on his chin and said, "The Ammon family is an ancient family clan from 1 to 2,000 years ago. It is almost history itself. I'm very curious, why did the gentleman that you met appear around the City of Silver? What is his goal?" "That's right, how could the Ammon family, which exists in the world of Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and company, appear around our City of Silver? Why did he fail to fulfill his promise after accepting the request of being a guest? He mysteriously left and caused the entire team to lose control. Yes, other than the captain, what did he want to do? What was he looking for? If he is a descendant of the Lord, perhaps his purpose is the same as mine, to find out the cause of the cataclysm from ancient times, and to find out the truth of the curse." Derek let his imagination run wild for a moment. After a while he shook his head and said, "Mr. Hanged Man, I'm unable to answer your question. I'm also trying to figure out this matter." Alger replied, looking somewhat disappointed. "Try to communicate with the former captain in your neighboring cell more. See if you can dig up more information from him." Upon saying this, he thought for a moment and warned, "However, you must be careful and prudent. I think that person is very dangerous." "Very dangerous? You think so too?" Derek asked, feeling somewhat surprised. The elders of the six-member council also thought the same. The Hanged Man looked up at the lofty dome and took a deep breath. Those who don't think so are the ones without sound mind. Seeing that the son was still confused, he shook his head and said, "He's the only surviving member of the exploration team. Just this matter alone is enough to prove that there's something tremendously wrong with him. He's been in the dungeon facing rampagers for 42 years, yet he remains very lucid and rational. This shows how weird he is. Compounded with the matter regarding the mysterious Ammon, the danger is obvious." These were the little bits and pieces that Derek had thought about in the past, but he hadn't yet connected together. When he heard that, he suddenly became enlightened and immediately said sincerely, "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man." Audrey, who was listening attentively and observing, resisted the urge to cover her face with her hand. She felt that the son was even more naive than she was. Seeing that everyone's curiosity had been satisfied, that even the gloomy Mr. World had slightly adjusted his posture, and that the son didn't seem to have any other requests, she turned her head to the end of the long bronze table and said with a smile, "Mr. Fool, I request a private exchange." Again, Klein was amused as he nodded and said, "Sure." He immediately shielded the senses of the Hanged Man and company, rather than isolating himself and Miss Justice. It was mainly because he was afraid that the others might end up communicating out of boredom, thereby exposing the fact that the world was only a repeater. After receiving the signal, Audrey smiled and said, "Mr. Fool, I have another 3 new pages of Roselle's diary." After the card of blasphemy was stolen by the fool's adorer, she didn't avoid visiting the Royal Museum out of guilt. Instead, she acted as if nothing had happened. She openly requested this to her father, and in the week after the exhibition ended, she got another chance to flip through the notebook. Audrey thought that appearing unfazed was the best way to avoid suspicion. If she maintained the constant act of feeling guilty and did not do what was logical, even if the Church of the God of Steam didn't suspect her previously, they would subsequently feel that there was a problem. According to her own experience, she believed that the very first few pages of a diary would reveal a lot of information, so she mainly memorized the first 3 pages. Without waiting for the fool to speak, she quickly added, "I understand that this isn't a matter that requires a private exchange, but I wish to keep this from Miss Magician for a week or 2. That way, even if she knows that you need Roselle's diary in the future, she wouldn't suspect that I'm Justice." She had seen Fours and Zio once midweek, and by leading the conversation, she had naturally mentioned how her beloved dog, Susie, had chewed the Roselle notebook, causing it to be irrecoverable. Typically speaking, she no longer needed to hide the fact that Mr. Fool needed Roselle's diary, but using her telepathist abilities, she simulated what Fours would think, believing that she would have such a thought. "What? That's a diary. That's a diary Roselle recorded his secrets in. Even Mr. Fool places so much importance on it. I recall that Miss Audrey has some. Wait a moment. She happened to have those diary pages chewed up by her dog a few days ago. Isn't this too much of a coincidence?" To prevent Fours from having such thoughts, Audrey hoped to keep it a secret for at least another week. After becoming a telepathist, not only was she able to see the aura and the emotional color of the target, but she was also able to read the superficial thoughts of others and could also simulate their thoughts. Thus, she understood one thing, that in the process of guiding others, she had to try her best not to be abrupt or act against logic and reason. Only when all the details were subtle enough and reasonable enough to make the target not realize that she was being guided would she be considered a qualified telepathist. Subtle and reasonable are the two most important keywords, Audrey concluded in her mind. The reason why she went to read Roselle's notebook, again, was precisely to avoid being unreasonable. She truly is worthy of being a telepathist. She's recognized long ago that Miss Magician is one of the two people that she had recommended. Klein smiled in a noncommittal manner. What do you want to exchange those 3 pages for? This question was asked with confidence because, after obtaining the Book of Secrets, his greatest weakness in the field of mysticism had already been bridged. As for the secrets of the other deities, as well as his knowledge of sequences, he knew a lot about them. Just any one of them was enough to deal with Miss Justice. You will still be friends if you don't talk about the psychiatrist's formula, Klein lampooned in his heart. Audrey had already long thought of her question. She remained reserved for a second before saying, Mr. Fool, I wish to ask one question. Why is it said that the cards of blasphemy hide the profound secrets of the deity? Great question. Klein smiled secretly. Giving her a look for her to figure it out herself, he said deeply and calmly, Sequence 0, Dark Emperor. Sequence 0. There's still a Sequence 0. There's a Sequence O above Sequence 1. Is that a sequence representing a god? The Dark Emperor is a god. A series of questions suddenly surfaced in Audrey's mind. This caused her to be pleasantly surprised, satisfied, and shocked. Restraining her agitation and unconcealable excitement, she took a deep breath and conjured the 3 pages of Roselle's diary. Klein took a quick glance, and confirmed that this was not one of the ones he had seen before. 23rd February, 1143. I've transmigrated to this world for more than a week. I have to write something down and describe the things I have encountered, or I feel like I'll go crazy. If I write it in simplified Chinese, I'm sure that no one will be able to decipher. This world uses alphabetical words. I'm now Roselle Gustav, but I'll never forget my real name. Huang Tao. I don't know how I transmigrated either. I carefully recalled and thought about it for a long time, and then I remembered that a few days before my transmigration, I bought a very mysterious silver plate with some strange symbols and patterns engraved on it. It was extremely interesting. However, it did not reappear after my transmigration. TT's not my cheat item. This is a world similar to ancient Europe. It's after the Renaissance, and cannons and guns have appeared, but they're rather crude and primitive. As for me, Huang Tao Roselle Gustav, as a fan of online literature, I loved reading transmigration with technology genre novels. I know quite a lot of useful things, and specifically read up on the corresponding knowledge. This is the stage where I can display my ability. But I realize that my F-King memory isn't good. I've almost forgotten everything. The heavens allowed me to transmigrate to another world, but I wasn't given an outstanding memory or system. Nor was I given a two-way door. How can I survive like this? Alright, start with some detail. When I have the money, I'll hire a bunch of craftsmen, inventors, and scientists. I'm only responsible for giving them ideas. It's been a long time since I felt so full of anticipation for the future. But I still miss Mom and Dad a little. Besides, the entertainment in this world is too monotonous. The 1 or 2 maids don't look that good, and their entire bodies exude rustic vibes. It makes me wish that Hongxiu goes completely bankrupt. Haven't finished reading Lin Gao's 500 Good-for-Nothings too, and there are so many beauties that are awaiting me on TikTok. The games Kings of Glory and PUBG are still waiting for me. Thinking about them makes me feel a little depressed. As Klein read, he nearly frowned. Initially, he had determined, from the appearance of Pirate King and the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, that Roselle had crossed over 3 to 5 years earlier than him. But now he realized that the gap between their transmigrations couldn't be more than a year. But why was there a difference of nearly 200 years on this side? Conundrum Klein thought seriously for a while and came up with all sorts of theories, but because he lacked the necessary information, he could only temporarily ascribe the cause of the matter to the difference in the flow of time between the Earth and this world. Roselle and I have transmigrated less than a year apart, but in this world we are separated by nearly 200 years. That is to say, Even if I were to spend 200 years to find a way to return, it's likely that I won't lose the opportunity to meet my parents. At most, I'd have been missing for a year. Klein made a contrasting inference, improving his mood significantly. He instantly felt filled with motivation. Of course, he himself knew very well that this reasoning was not rigorous, because this was determined by one precondition, and it was currently impossible to confirm it. What if Roselle transmigrated after me? That might involve so-called spatial-temporal turbulence. When the time comes, there is no guarantee that I'll return to the proper time node. Klein poured cold water on his burgeoning mood. Roselle's first diary entry was the product of having held back for a long time, therefore. It took up more than 2 pages. Klein flipped to the end and read the remaining 2 lines. 25th February. What a boring world. There are no newspapers and so few novels. I think I need to help this culturally impoverished society, but the premise of this is that I have to get some money and recall how paper is made and how the print press is done. As a transmigrator, I can only live on the pocket money that my new dad and mom gave me. I can only occasionally see 1 or 2 shiny Fermo gold. What a tragic story. However, hunting is quite interesting. 28th February. This world might be a little different from what I know it to be. T got lost while hunting in the woods today. As a result, I saw an unimaginably intense battle. In the battle, the man who was surrounded had additional eyes growing on his face, a total of 4 eyes. They even shot dark green light. This is King illogical. Is this a humanoid monster? This is actually a fantasy world, right? That monster's opponent was even more powerful. He summoned a pillar of light that burned with golden flame. Yes, I think it was summoned. Fortunately, they didn't discover me. After getting rid of that monster, that person left with the corpse. Huang Tao am indeed the protagonist. I discovered the truth of this world a few days after I transmigrated. Perhaps they can recognize the mysterious symbols and patterns on the silver token. Of course, I won't ask. I want to become like them and crack it myself. There's another key reason as to why I said this. I can't even King remember what the pattern looks like. I can only vaguely remember it. Indeed, the protagonist. Emperor, did you pour all of your 8th grader syndrome soul into your diary? Klein couldn't help but lampoon. He was very interested in the silver plate, which might have been the cause for Roselle's transmigration, and he was eager to find out what the symbols and patterns on it looked like. If he could really decipher it by relying on the mysticism knowledge of this world, then transmigration might not have just been a coincidence. Klein put down the diary pages, wrapped his fingers on the table, and lifted the screen that isolated the hanged man and the magician. Go ahead and trade freely. Klein leaned back in his chair and smiled. Forrest took a deep breath and said, I would like to purchase the stomach pouch of a spirit eater and 20 ml of blood from a deep-sea marlin. It will be paid for in gold pounds. I still have 430 pounds. I can afford one, she silently encouraged herself. As for where the rest of the money would come from, she had no idea. This is one of the main reasons that prevent many Beyonders from advancing. People cannot really attempt to spend beyond their means. If it wasn't for me having to become a trickmaster to completely be rid of the influence of the full moon's ravings, I wouldn't even consider advancement once I gained rich Beyonder me. I wouldn't even make contact with this circle. I'll write books, save up money, drink tea, and stroll the streets with Zia. Once she's finished with that task, we can travel to different parts of the northern and southern continent. We don't have to be afraid of danger or accidents, and we can enjoy life. Forrest's thoughts suddenly began to wander. Just when she thought that no one would respond, Alger said in a low voice, I saw the deep-sea marlin's blood at the recent gathering of the great pirates, but unfortunately, you've already missed it. You should have said so earlier. No, I'm mistaken. You hadn't joined the tarot club back then. Then what's the point of saying this? Showing off your experience. Forrest curled her lip secretly but said in all seriousness, Mr. Hanged man, please keep an eye out for me. I can accept a price between 300 and 400 pounds. Alger sneered. The sea is even vaster than the land. Pirates might not even meet each other in half a year. Even on the islands that they dispose of their loot, Beyonder ingredients are seldom gathered. Only big cities like Backland, Trier, St. Millum, and Fainapotter can have many ingredients gathered together. From your accent, you should be a Backland citizen, or someone who has been living in Backland for many years. You mean that I still need to rely on myself? Forrest almost looked up at the high dome. At this point, Derek said, I know roughly where a few spirit eaters are active, but I don't need the gold pounds you people talk about. Forrest said with a fake smile, what do you want? The formula for the solar high priest potion, Audrey quickly answered inwardly. Derek thought seriously and said, the solar high priest potion formula. That's a sequence 7 formula, right? I've heard of it, but the formula for this sequence is at least 750 pounds, and if you're in a hurry to get it, it can be sold for more than 1,000 pounds. Furthermore, the stomach bag of a spirit eater and blood of a deep-sea marlin do not exceed 400 pounds each. They're only worth 300 pounds most of the time. Do you understand me? Forrest tried to make it clear to the son that this was not an equivalent transaction. Without hesitation, Derek replied, I can give you 2 or 3 of the spirit eater's stomach bags. As for the additional need for a deep-sea marlin, he didn't even consider it. He had never even seen the sea before. What can I do with the additional spirit eater's stomach bags? Roast them or fry them? To be honest, I have no idea when I'll be able to sell it. Most importantly, I'm unable to afford the formula for Solar High Priest. Forrest forced a smile and said, I'll try searching. She thought of the masked eternal blazing sun believer at Mr. A's gathering, who was good at purification. She thought of the band of light ring, and she believed that she could get a clue to the potion formula of Solar High Priest. But I don't have enough money. Forrest thought for a moment, touched her face, looked around, and then asked with great sincerity, Everyone, do you have any good ways of earning money? As soon as she finished her sentence, she realized that everyone had fallen into silence. Silence could be described by the soundless palace and the quiet gray fog. From the looks of it, everyone faces this conundrum. As for Mr. Fool, he doesn't need money. Forrest wisely shut her mouth. Isn't the best way to make money be from owning farms, mines, plantations, factories, stocks, etc.? Oh, you can also go through the kingdom's bounty notices and complete them in accordance with the price and the period of time at a bearable level. Audrey knew that she didn't have any real experience in making money, so she could only respond with a few words in her heart as if she was joking. Might I interest you in bicycle projects? Klein resisted the urge to manipulate the words of the world, which would expose his true identity. After waiting for a few seconds, he maintained an unfathomable posture, making the world gloomily and hoarsely say, Help me keep a lookout for the 1,000-faced hunter's mutated pituitary gland and blood, as well as a human skin, Shadow's characteristic, and a deep-sea Naga's hair. Although Klein only had 589 gold pounds left, he now had the Bayunder characteristic of a werewolf and the biological poison bot. Furthermore, he was considering to find an opportunity to turn the former into a mystical item and then sell one of them. In that case, that's more than enough to match the cost of Sequence 6 Bayunder ingredient. Therefore, he planned to have the members of the Tarot Club help him pay attention in advance so that he wouldn't miss them. All right. The son, Derek, answered first, but he made no promises. Compared to Spirit Eater, human-skin shadows and 1,000-faced hunters aren't monsters that are easy to encounter. 1,000-faced hunter. I think I've seen a fossil of it, Justice thought as she replied. Yes, Peel confirmed that after I returned. That fossil was in Duke Negan's treasury. If it's already a fossil, its Bayunder characteristic has probably long been taken away. Klein manipulated the world and nodded noncommittally. After a moment of silence, Alger said, Help me keep an eye out on a person who was involved in the disappearance of the colonial slaves that was mentioned before. He calls himself Balin, a man with reddish-brown skin, and has the clear characteristics of a southerner, but someone has overheard him speak in a backland accent. The third tooth on his left is missing, but it could very well have been replaced. In addition, there's nothing special about him, and his height is also quite average. TF, you can find traces of him. There will be no problem with the reward at all, with it being at least 100 pounds or something of equal value. Even divination can't be completed with such a description, let alone carrying out a search for the person in the real world. Klein looked around and said, Continue with your free exchange. At the end of the tarot gathering, Derek returned to the real world and found himself in the dark, cramped room. He sat on the ground cautiously for a few seconds, but he didn't discover any unusual changes. He was finally able to let out a sigh of relief. Remembering that Mr. Hanged Man had advised him to talk more with the former exploratory team's captain, Derek walked over to the corresponding metal wall, bent his fingers, and tapped on it. Taku, Taku. He completed his signal, but there was no response even after a long time. Did he fall asleep? Or was he taken to the six-member council? Derek wondered while looking at the dull metal wall. At this moment, an elderly and fleeting voice came from the bed behind him. "Are you looking for me? Are you looking for me?" The moment the voice entered his ears, Derek froze. His skin tensed up and his hair stood on end. Why is he behind me? Why is he in my room? What happened to the seal? What about the effects of the mystical item? His forehead dripped with cold sweat, and he subconsciously wanted to turn around to take a look. But his instinct stopped him from doing so. This instinct originated from the teachings of the City of Silver's general knowledge of monsters lesson, and the strange scene he had experienced after joining the patrolling team. When someone is speaking behind you, don't turn around in a hurry. Derek raised his hands and clenched them into fists in front of his chest. Then slowly, he turned around, bit by bit. The room was shrouded in darkness, making it impossible to see anything. However, there was a tint of golden light that was expanding in his two eyes, transforming into what seemed like two miniature suns. With his light suppliant powers, he saw a dark figure sitting quietly on the edge of his bed. The dark figure rapidly turned clear, revealing a head that had been split in half. In the middle of his head, two gray brains wriggled like they were alive, trying to get close to each other but being unable to do so. The thick, viscous liquid on the severed surface of his brain had turned into thin threads, but they were shrinking like maggots. Each eye that was on the two separate sides were distanced apart, and the nose bridge was separated from the middle. The color of the blood was bright and evident. The left side of his mouth was open, but the right side of his mouth was tightly shut. This terrifying monster was naked, and there were numerous dark red wounds on its body. The countless wounds had torn open savagely, revealing rows and rows of white teeth. They said the same sentence in quick succession. "Are you looking for me?" It paused for a moment, the corners of its mouth and the edges of its wounds were curling up. "Look, am I not normal?" Derek's pupils contracted, and without thinking he placed his folded hands on his chest and raised them to his chin, as if in prayer. The small room suddenly became bright, and a pure beam of light, swirling with fire, fell from the roof and onto the monster's body. The beam was not as grand as the one used by Derek outside the spire. This was because of the seal here and the mystical item, which left him isolated from the spire's exterior. But at that moment, Derek was stunned to see the holy light beam that he had prayed for was suddenly thickening. It was so bright that he couldn't help but close his eye. A few moments later, something purer and thicker separated from the magnificent pillar of light. It was like a man made of light, with no facial features and no clothes. The man of light suddenly coruscated and pounced on the monster. All the mouths on the monster suddenly opened, as if it was letting out a blood-curdling screech. Yet Derek heard nothing. The monster began to tremble violently and quickly disintegrated under the burning and illumination of the man of light, disappearing as if it were melting. Just as it was about to become transparent, a phantom wearing a black classical long robe and a pointed hat suddenly appeared. The shadow had black hair, black eyes, a wide forehead, and a thin face. It wore a monocle carved from crystal. As soon as he appeared, the man of light exploded, and Derek's vision was filled with whiteness. When his eyesight was restored, he found himself outside the room, in the corridor with the metal lamps set in it, in the dim light of the setting sun. He tilted his head blankly and looked into the room. He saw a tall, muscular figure in dark trousers and a brown coat. In front of this figure was the bed which Derek had been sleeping in. Dawn-like rays of light condensed onto a white leg bone, turning it into a pure white, sharp sword. Next to the straight sword lay a translucent worm. It was only the length of a thumb, and its slimness was almost that of a child's finger. One ring after another, of completely transparent colors, divided it into many sections. It was a fleeting scene, and without specially counting the number of rings, he had a vague feeling that there were about 10 of them. The tall figure, which had its back facing him, reached out his hand to pick up the strange, translucent worm. As he turned around, he sighed. TT was close. At that moment, Derek finally saw the face of the tall figure. His hair was grizzled, unkempt, and rather disheveled. He had deep wrinkles around his cheeks, but there were no wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Some old scars that were either deep or twisted remained on his cheeks. He was dressed in a flaxen-colored shirt with a checkered leather belt around his waist, and his pale blue eyes were deep and weathered, like a book full of stories. For a moment Derek was stunned, and then, as though he had been in danger all his life, he opened his mouth in pleasant surprise. "Your Excellency." In front of him was Chief of the City of Silver's six-member council, a powerful demon hunter who was over 100 years old, Colin Iliad. Colin nodded slightly and said, "We always knew that he had a problem, but in order to find out what kind of ulterior motives the man named Ammon had, we intentionally didn't eliminate him directly, and we instead locked him at the bottom of the spire, sealed under the influence of mystical items, and we often let Beyonders, who only have symptoms of losing control, live next to him and talk to him. We wanted to see if we could induce some abnormal changes in him in order to learn the information we wanted to know. Unfortunately, he had been very normal until today, way too normal. Why do you think he suddenly mutated and attempted to break through the seal? Do you have any idea what makes you different from the others? So it was purposely arranged for me to live next to the former exploration team captain. After a few seconds of silence, Derek said, maybe it's because my Beyonder pathway is different from the others. Sequence 9 Bard, Sequence 8 Light Suppliant. In other words, the Sun pathway, if Mr. Hanged Man is right, that the Ammon family is the descendant of an ancient sun god, then it's normal for me to cause a mutation to happen to him. Derek felt he knew the truth to a certain extent. Colin listened without a change in expression. He sized up Derek for a few seconds before saying, "We were monitoring him. The members of the six-member council took turns, but we didn't expect him to suddenly mutate. There were 0 warning signs, and his actions were very decisive and determined." "What were you doing in the room just now?" Derek, who was considering the relationship between the sun pathway and the ancient sun god, didn't instantly realize what the chief was asking about. When he realized it, his mind was still blank as he seriously recalled what he had done. "I didn't do anything. I just knocked on the wall and tried to talk to him. Before this, I was participating in the tarot gathering." The tarot gathering. Derek was suddenly stunned. He felt that things might not be as simple as he had imagined. He knew that he couldn't inform the chief of his thoughts, but he didn't know what kind of expression to make, so he could only maintain his lonely, reserved silence. He said thoughtfully, "I knocked on that wall 3 times. Before that, the candle in my room had extinguished, and there was complete darkness. I had tried to practice some of my Beyonder powers." Colin looked into Derek's eyes quietly and said after nearly 20 seconds, "Unfortunately, what Ammon left in his soul was not his original body. Moreover, this matter happened too suddenly, so we were unable to obtain the desired result. Before his mutation, did you sense anything amiss?" "No." Derek shook his head with conviction. Colin's eyes suddenly flashed with 2 complex, dark green symbols, and he reflected Derek's body in them. After nearly 10 seconds of silence, the City of Silver's chief closed his eyes and said, "Your condition has stabilized. You don't need any more treatment, so you can go back now." Derek was startled. "All right." He watched demon hunter Colin Iliad turn back into the room, pick up the sharp white sword, and turned it over and over in his hands. He quietly took a deep breath and walked along the corridor towards the exit. On the way, he met the keepers who had rushed over one after the other. He slowly walked back home and closed the door. He carefully observed his surroundings for a while. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed and recited in a low voice, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. You are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog. You are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. You have just experienced something terrifying." Derek recounted what had happened and mentioned his 2 guesses. After doing all of that, he felt much more at ease. And with his tense state of mind relaxing, he felt immense exhaustion wash through him. He lied down and quickly fell asleep. In the silent and dark room, flashes of lightning would occasionally illuminate everything. Otherwise, it would seem like the dark night. The sleeping Derek suddenly flicked his right index finger and leisurely tapped it on the bed. Once, twice, thrice. After the tarot gathering, Klein didn't divine the werewolf's Beyonder characteristic or the biological poison bottle due to his spirituality expenditure. Instead, he went straight back to the real world for a nap. After 20 minutes, he woke up and drew the curtain, allowing the light that penetrated through the mist to bring a certain degree of light into the room. Sitting on the chair in front of the desk, Klein calmed down and began considering what he needed to do in the short term. The main goal is to continue concluding the rules of a magician and make adjustments according to the subtle feedback from my spirituality. ID 6. Although rules like never performing unprepared, the need to have a stage and a performance, and completing a performance using means of diversion do not seem problematic at the moment. If I were to continue acting this way and performing slight adjustments, I'll eventually digest the potion and reach the advancement state. But this sort of acting isn't sufficient. I'm still lacking some of the important rules. Currently, what I'm doing will make the digestion slow and not thorough. Perhaps it will take a year, or perhaps even 2 or 3 years before my sequence advancement is possible. And see, Zhangwell won't remain there waiting for me. Only through becoming a high-sequence Beyonder, as soon as possible, will I be qualified to take revenge. Therefore, figuring out the other magician rules is of utmost importance. I'll first determine them through experimentation, whether the applause from an audience will stir my spirituality and result in better digestion of the potion. Just as Klein was deep in thought, he heard a series of illusory stacked pleas. Ritual A male voice. Is it Mr. Hanged Man or Little Son? Klein looked out the window at the gloomy sky, got up, went into the bathroom next door. He locked the door, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and arrived above the gray fog. Within that mysterious space, a towering ancient palace quietly stood. The illusory male voice echoed in a stacked, continuous manner. Klein glanced at it and confirmed that the prayer was from Little Son. He sat in the fool's seat and stretched out his right hand, emanating his spirituality to touch the corresponding crimson star. Suddenly, the voice became clear and layered, and Klein quickly figured out what the son was talking about. The former captain of the exploration team who had seen Ammon suddenly lost control and strangely penetrated through the seal, arriving at his room. Fortunately, the City of Silver took this matter seriously and had been constantly prepared for it. Otherwise, it would have led to a tragedy. The son believes that it's impossible, that there was no reason for the man's loss of control. He came up with 2 possibilities. One was that his own Beyonder pathway met the requirements of being the ancient sun god's descendant, and the other possibility was that the man might have sensed the tarot gathering and Mr. Fool's secret pull. If it were the former, he wouldn't have waited until today and waited until the end of the tarot gathering before losing control. The latter reason has a greater probability. This is the first time I've encountered someone who can sense the matters regarding the gray fog. That Ammon is very scary. It's no wonder their family was known as the blasphemers during the 4th epoch. Even their last names are taboo. Klein subconsciously looked at the crimson star and the corresponding supplicant. He carefully observed the blurry image of Little Son to see if there was anything abnormal with it. Klein believed that Ammon wouldn't be so easily eliminated. Even if it was, as the chief of the City of Silver had said, that his body wasn't his main body, it didn't make it any easier to eliminate. The only possibility is that the powerhouses in the City of Silver have been using mystical items to monitor him. But is that even possible? When he decided to let the former leader of the exploration team lose control and silently penetrate through the seal, he definitely had a plan in place. In the midst of his thoughts, Klein's eyes suddenly froze as he looked at the prayer scene. Entwined on the indistinct body of the sun was a translucent and illusory figure. He had hands and feet, but he was like a python, twisting around the sun while his head rested behind the sun's head. In the blurred image, he was wearing a black classical robe, a pointed hat, and a crystal monocle. The sun didn't notice any of this. Klein almost drew a cold gasp, shocked at the strange means that were available to that entity. He vaguely understood the other party's intention. By residing in the spirit body of the sun, he is waiting for the next tarot gathering, allowing him to sneak above the gray fog, like a virus or a Trojan horse. When that happens, my control over this mysterious space might be snatched away. He's truly a blasphemer. Fortunately, Little Son is rather naive and straightforward, so he immediately reported this to me. Through the corresponding crimson stars and the power of the gray fog, I was able to discover his peculiar state. Klein drew a breath and tried to calm himself. At that moment, he had to respond. He had to quickly think of a way to get Ammon out of the sun, or temporarily expel the sun out of the tarot gathering. Looking at himself from his Beyonder powers of magician, clown, and seer, to Azek's copper whistle, the dark emperor card, the all-black eye, the sun brooch, the biological poison bottle, and so on, Klein couldn't find a way to deal with Ammon. Ammon's sequence is definitely above sequence 4, and the means available to him must be sufficiently strained. To be able to escape from the City of Silver's mystical artifacts and powerful demon hunters, it means that he isn't something which can be easily eliminated with ordinary objects or power. After thinking for a moment and looking around, Klein discovered there was only one possibility of eliminating Ammon, the gray fog, this mysterious space. I have to think of a way to pry its power away. The sacrifice and bestowment ritual from before are examples. With this train of thought, Klein turned his gaze to the Book of Secrets. This mysticism book, which originated from the ancient shaman King Klarman, recorded many mysterious rituals that required help from the primitive moon. Klein, who had been reading it before, vaguely remembered that a few of them were suitable for such a scenario. Of course, it was unknown what changes he would have to make after directing it towards the fool. He could only keep his hopes up and try his best. As Klein flipped through the book, his eyes stopped at a ritual. Blood Moon Sacrifice. This ritualistic magic was clearly different from the simple ones that Klein had learned before, and it used the element of a secret deed. The process was to use a material rich in spirituality, preferably the blood of a beyonder, to write the honorable name of the target of the secret deed on an animal hide, and to draw the corresponding symbols and magic labels. If necessary, the specific circumstances of a given time and place also had to be taken into account. When this was done, the ritual host would set up the altar, pick up the piece of hide, and repeat the honorable name, letting their spirituality to seep into the hide, gradually spreading it out, little by little to form a hidden bond with the corresponding great being, and obtaining the corresponding spiritual experience or help. The final outcome of this ritual was unknown. It all depended on what the hidden or great being bestowed. Or rather, according to one's characteristics, the knowledge and power one could gain through that secret bond were also different. This kind of rather vague and subjective ritual gave Klein enough freedom to modify and manipulate. If he had assumed the stance of forcefully eliminating Ammon from the beginning, then Ammon would have certainly resisted and created a dangerous accident. If the target of the secret deed were the true creator or the hidden sage, it's normal for the ritual to end in madness. Klein mumbled as he conjured a pen and paper and began to modify the Blood Moon Sacrifice to turn it into a secret deed ritual that belonged to the fool. First, he replaced the honorable name with the 3 sentences of King of Yellow and Black. Then he replaced the symbolic symbol with the one behind the seat of the fool. It was a unique symbol, made up of a part of the hidden pupilless eye and the contorted lines. The third was to design the corresponding magic label according to the symbols and his mysticism knowledge. This was the most difficult step. Any mistakes would cause the entire ritual to produce unpredictable developments. Lastly, he had to modify the layout of the altar to make it closer to the fool and to the King of Yellow and Black. After busying himself for quite a while, Klein had a new secret deed ritual, but he was unsure if it would work. He examined it over and over again, and after confirming that there were no mistakes, he emanated his spirituality and heavily replied to Little Son, "I'm aware. T have something to task you with. Let's see if this ritual works." The son Derek suddenly woke up from his dreamless slumber. Before his eyes were the boundless gray fog and the lofty fool. His ears echoed with bits of illusory and distant work. He knew that Mr. Fool would occasionally ask the members of the Tarot Club to make small attempts, as if to verify something. He wasn't surprised by this, and he immediately sat up and began to search for a monster hide, exotic herbs, and other objects. As for the spiritual materials described in the ceremony, Derek didn't waste time heading to the spire or the underground market to buy them. He picked up the axe of Hurricane and sliced a tiny wound in his arm. Silently, he used his own blood as ink, and he wrote the name of the fool and its corresponding symbols and magic labels on the pitted monster hide. After a while, he put down the quill that was stained with blood. He saw many mysterious symbols on the hide, and the colors were bright red and had an indescribable hint of demonic dealing. After dealing with the wound on his arm, the pale-faced Derek quickly finished setting up the altar. He picked up the blood-red word and all kinds of terrifying symbols from the hide and held it tightly in his hand. He looked at the flickering candle flame in front of him, closed his eyes, lowered his head, and repeatedly recited the honorable names of the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the King of Yellow and Black who wields good luck. Derek's spirituality slowly flowed out and infused the hide, and the words in Jotun and the magic symbols on it quickly brightened. It was a startling crimson color. At that moment, he, who had already entered into a cogitation state, was only feeling his psyche gradually dissipate as it floated to an immeasurable height, coming into contact with the grayish-white fog and the hidden great being. Above the gray fog, inside the palace that looked like a giant's residence. Noticing that the sun had not shown any signs of delay in preparing the ritual, Klein chose to wait there above the gray fog. Suddenly, he felt the entire mysterious space start to tremble. That motionless grayish-white fog started to flow. The crimson star corresponding to the sun shined brightly and emitted illusory rays of light like the tide. These countless rays of light condensed into a blurry figure of the sun. He was in a supplicating position with his eyes closed and his head lowered, waiting for the moment when he could bond with the great being and gain a miraculous spiritual experience. The translucent figure on his body was still tightly coiled like a python, but its head was already tilted back as it looked up. The crystal monocle it wore flashed dimly. He's searching for the subtle, hidden connection. He should have recognized that this is just a secret deed ritual, but he didn't do anything to stop it. Is he trying to find the connection through it? Klein suddenly came to this realization and felt the gray fog and the mysterious space above it simultaneously rippling with power. However, for the time being, Klein couldn't combine these forces with his own spirituality to create a Beyonder effect that could exorcise the evil spirit, unless there was another corresponding ritual. Clearly, this was impossible. He couldn't maintain two rituals simultaneously. Klein's eyes quickly swept the area in front of him, and his gaze stopped at the sun brooch. Authority, perhaps I can use it as a bridge. Just as this thought flashed through Klein's mind, his right hand grabbed the sunbird-shaped dark golden brooch. At the same time, he used his spirituality as a whirlpool to attract the pride power from the mysterious space towards him, making it surge towards the sun brooch like a tidal wave. Quivering above the gray fog became obvious. Little dots of pure light intertwined and swept toward Klein, blending with his spirituality. The sunbird-shaped dark golden brooch began to glow with a dazzling brilliance. It grew brighter and denser, and in an instant, drop after drop of a translucent golden liquid began to condense. The liquid quickly merged together and formed a human figure that was as tall as Klein. It was a golden figure, a sacred figure. It does work. Sun holy water that's created from a higher level of power is closer to God's bestowment. Klein's heart was filled with joy. He turned his gaze back to the crimson star, which symbolized the sun. He then looked at the figure that was waiting to bond with the great being. As for the divine figure condensed by the golden sun holy water, it wasn't a result of the sun brooch, but simply a manifestation of Klein's subconscious thought. Reaching this step, he had already allowed the golden figure to move forward. Through the illusory crimson star, it merged with little sun through the secret deed ritual as it dispelled the evil spirit, hidden inside his body, as well as giving him a certain amount of knowledge and a miraculous spiritual experience. However, Klein didn't have much confidence at that very moment. The power of the mysterious space was obviously higher than his spirituality, making him unable to smoothly control the power. As such, the power of the golden figure was mixed, chaotic, and insufficiently coordinated. If he used it as is, the effect was, at most, 10% of what he expected. As for Ammon, who was suspected to be a descendant of the ancient sun god, he was born into a family of blasphemers in the Tudor Empire's fourth epoch. Even if it wasn't his main body, he was able to successfully hide his identity from the powerful high-sequence demon hunter and the powerful mystical items that protected the existence of the City of Silver. Klein truly didn't have much confidence with the effect, only amounting to 10%. His initial plan was only to give it a try. If it really didn't work, he would temporarily bar the sun and then reconnect with him when he found a better solution. However, having come this far, Klein naturally wanted the best outcome and strived to succeed in one go. Having disguised himself as the godlike fool, he too had a little pride, and he wanted to keep up his reputation. He gave a self-deprecating laugh as he prepared to find a way to increase the effects of the golden figure to dispel the evil entity at the last moment. Of course, I can only waste a few seconds, otherwise the ritual would be over. Klein's eyes swept over the items on the long bronze table again, thinking only of the words high level. Due to his spirituality's intuition as a seer, his gaze landed on an item. The card of blasphemy, the Dark Emperor card. Of all the items Klein owned, it was the only one that matched the words high level. As for Azek's copper whistle, Klein clearly remembered that it had been completely suppressed when the Blackthorn security company faced off with the spawn of the evil god. However, what the Dark Emperor card's high level pertains to is the knowledge contained inside. That's not right. After the owner advances to become a high-sequence Beyonder, it can produce subtle responses with the Beyonder ingredients that are needed. Furthermore, it also possesses the characteristics of anti-divination and anti-prophecy. In other words, its level isn't low. I don't need to use it for a fight, as long as I can use its high level to suppress the power of this mysterious space above the fog. And if I can minimize the chaotic and unnatural coordination of the golden figure, that will be enough. Klein quickly came up with an idea. He reached out his hand towards the Dark Emperor card, which had its back facing up. Just then, he noticed a frightening scene through the corner of his eye. Within the shadow of the sun that was formed by the illusory rays of the crimson star, a palm, so shriveled that only skin and bones remained, was suddenly reaching forward. Slowly but firmly, it grabbed at the boundary of the crimson star, giving off a feeling as if it was piercing through reality and entering the psyche domain. Ammon was attempting to use the connection to rip open the boundary and extend his hand into the gray fog. Whoosh! For the first time, the endless grayish-white fog was in chaos. The flowing from before seemed to turn into waves as gales formed. Klein's pupils shrank. He no longer hesitated, and he picked up the Dark Emperor card. As soon as he held this item in his hand, he immediately felt that his spirituality was no longer subdued by the power of the mysterious space. Suddenly, the golden figure became abnormally tall, and on its back, it grew pairs of enormous pitch-black wings. There were a total of 12 pairs. On each pair of wings, there were dark and bright feathers engraved with many mysterious symbols. The contrast between gold and black was stark, and the huge figure, driven by Klein, spread its wings to cover the vast dome of the towering palace. Without a sound, the sacred yet corrupted figure of light and darkness flashed over, overlapping with the manifestation of little sun that was formed by the crimson star. The light and shadows intersected, and a fierce wind blew in all directions. The palm that was so shriveled that it didn't have any flesh, to the point of only having skin and bones left, shrank backward uncontrollably, but it also firmly refused to retreat. It was like a man falling off a cliff who had extended his hand to grab a bulge, unwilling to let go regardless of what happened. Whoosh! In the midst of the illusory and chaotic sounds, light and darkness completely erupted. The shriveled hand finally lost its support, and it plummeted, constantly disintegrating and disappearing as it did. After a few seconds, the gray fog and the mysterious space above it returned to its previous tranquility, as if no one had stepped inside for thousands of years. Klein focused again, and saw that the blurry figure of Little Sun was no longer entangled with the twisted and incorporeal entity. Phew! Unable to stop himself, he heaved a sigh of relief. Then he conjured the contrasting image from before, and threw them at the manifested figure of Little Sun in the crimson rays of light, allowing him to fully comprehend them. In the Berg household in the City of Silver, Derek felt both awake and adrift at the same time. It was as if he could see shadows of ineffable shapes, different colors of light that contained endless knowledge, and a majestic, tall, golden figure looking down upon everything. This figure stood beside Mr. Fool in the thick gray fog, with 12 pairs of huge, dark, mysterious wings on his back. Not only did his body and mind become warm and pure, but he also seemed to understand what was called sunlight. He had even figured out holy water creation, as well as the knowledge to exorcise evil spirits. It also contained images he couldn't understand, such as a towering, hidden pyramidal mausoleum. In that intoxicating spiritual experience, it was as if he had returned to his most carefree childhood, to the lands where the sun shone in his imagination, and it was only when everything was gone and the simple furnishings of his room came into view that he snapped back to his senses. Is this the secret deed ritual as referenced in textbooks? For more than 2,000 years, no one in the City of Silver has succeeded before. No one has been able to come into contact with a mighty existence. At that moment, Derek's low spirits and loneliness lessened. A heartfelt smile beamed on his face. The Fool's so-called experiment was to confirm whether our City of Silver's environment can perform a secret deed ritual. That wondrous feeling of all that knowledge was the payment he gave me. Derek lowered his head again and said with great respect, "Thank you, Mr. Fool." Right at this moment, a grayish-white fog suddenly appeared in front of his eye. In the center of the fog was a lofty chair. It was the leisurely seated Fool. Then Derek saw himself covered in a transparent, illusory shadow. The figure wore a black classic robe, a matching pointed hat, and a crystal monocle hung from its face. It coiled around his body like a python. This Ammon wasn't dead. He evaded the detection of the mystical items and the attention of His Excellency, and he became a parasite on my spirit body. Derek's eyes widened, and he saw himself as he was now, no longer entangled by Ammon. Did Mr. Fool notice him and finish him? Derek's sunken heart calmed down, while cold sweat trickled down his forehead due to the lingering fear. His face, on the other hand, displayed an expression of instinctive reverence. He subconsciously followed the words described in the mythology course and said, "Praise you, the mighty Mr. Fool." Somewhere in the deep darkness, a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the surrounding. This was a plain that was filled with ravines, and a dark green single-eyed giant was wandering about subconsciously. His eyes were lifeless, and his face was covered with traces of rotting pus. Grayish-yellow gas permeated from his body and interwoven in the air, forming many clouds. And beneath his feet, in the darkest ravine on the plain, there was a figure standing at the edge, overlooking the land below. With the help of the lightning, a thick and broad grayish-white building could be vaguely seen at the bottom of the ravine. The figure was dressed in a black classic robe and a pointed cap of the same color. It had curly black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and thin cheeks. It looked identical to the phantom Derek Berg had seen. He raised his hand and pinched the crystal monocle. Then he turned his head to the left and looked into the distance. As expected, he suddenly whispered in the language of ancient Fasak. After pausing for a moment, the man smiled and said the words, "The fool." Before he finished speaking, he had already jumped into the ravine in front of him. At this moment, the lightning subsided for a second, and darkness completely enveloped the world. After eliminating the fatal threat, Klein returned to the real world, once again feeling the urgent need to advance his sequence. The Ammon that I eliminated wasn't the main body. If he truly is interested in the mysterious space above the gray fog, he will soon return to the City of Silver. At that time, I wonder if the two legendary mystical items and the 3 demon hunters will be able to stop him. For a mere clone to be so bizarre and terrifying, one can imagine how powerful his main body is. Therefore, I need to conclude the rest of the magician rules as soon as possible, and through digestion and advancement, better grasp the mysterious space above the gray. Perhaps the City of Silver's shepherd elder will be you. If she really is corrupted by the true creator, Klein opened the bathroom door and went down to the first floor while in deep thought. Serenity, what about the rest of the magician's rule? As Klein idly leafed through the newspaper he had finished reading, he thought about the issues that mattered most to him. He had already considered one point before, and that was the difference between having an audience to cheer for him and not having one. However, just this alone didn't seem sufficient. With this thought, Klein's thoughts ran wild as he inexplicably thought of something. When I was still a seer, being recognized and praised as a true fortune teller would give me a feeling that the process of digesting the magic potion had become faster. After I concluded the seer principles, I began to believe that there was no direct correlation between the views and feedback from others, and that they were merely expressions, nothing substantial. If I act well enough, I would naturally be acknowledged, and my digestion would naturally be faster. That is to say, I had always believed that they were two different responses with the same gains, and not something related to causality. But now, there's the choice of receiving an audience's applause. If it does help me digest the potion, does it mean that some performances really require feedback, and the way that others view me can subtly affect the progress of my potion's digestion? By extension, would the establishment of the churches by the 7 Orthodox gods, the spreading of their faith, and the nurturing of their followers partially be a result of this? This is truly a sacrilegious thought. I'm indeed not a person who sincerely worships God. I will praise them, but I won't blindly believe in them. Klein quickly adjusted his train of thought as he searched for another angle of attack. He repeatedly compared the subtle differences between seer, clown, and magician. Gradually, he came up with an idea. In comparison, does a magician, who needs to perform, possess the need to take the initiative? Taking the initiative to perform, instead of being passive like a seer or clown. From the perspective of fate, it also fits. From a seer's reverence of fate, a clown's characteristic of being teased by fate while still maintaining a smile, and finally a magician who takes the initiative to challenge fate. Even if the result is nothing real or substantial, he will still receive the audience's applause from his deception. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he planned to make attempts in taking the initiative to perform. Where should I start? It should be something relatively less dangerous. I can consider the imprisonment of that vampire named Emlyn White by Father Atravsky. However, I need to confirm that this group of non-humans abide by the law and only engage in petty theft at the worst. Where do Emlin's companions stay on the southern side of the bridge? I can't really remember. I'll have to use divination to jog my memory. I'll also confirm how dangerous it is. Having come to this conclusion, Klein put down the newspaper, got up, and went upstairs. It had to be said that he didn't have any other motivation to actively involve himself in something that had almost nothing to do with it. It wasn't his personality, but in order to act, he had to force himself to do so. This is considered rather simple for me. How would a straight male act as a witch and demoness of pleasure? It's no wonder the City of Silver emphasizes that you're only acting. Klein suddenly understood the meaning of the admonition. City of Silver, in a dark room at the top of the spire. Chief of the six-member council, Colin Iliad, stood in front of a window, staring at the Silver City which was shrouded in darkness and lightning. Those beams of light illuminated his disheveled white hair, revealing his twisted and hideous old scars on his face, as well as the deep wrinkles on his face and his worried eye. After an unknown period of time, Colin turned and looked at a dark corner. He asked in a deep voice, "Find anything?" In the corner, a shadow stood up. It was pitch black as it shot towards the wall, twisting and whirling. Its voice carried the feeling of metal rubbing against metal, and it was rather jarring to the ears. After Derek Berg returned home, he showed some signs of abnormality, but there was no immediate need to deal with it. Colin nodded slightly and said, "What did he do?" With the help of the mystical item at the bottom of the spire, the rampager and the clone of the mysterious figure were eliminated. However, he had constantly suspected that the matter had not been completely resolved. The former captain of the exploration team suddenly lost control. The mysterious person recklessly took action after enduring for a full 42 years, without any consideration for the traps or the consequences. All of this made Colin, who had killed and hunted many monsters, instinctively feel that something was amiss. Therefore, he believed that this was a deliberate choice made by the mysterious man. Although the real purpose of the mysterious man was still unknown, he definitely had some sort of follow-up method, and it wouldn't be so simple to get rid of him. After using his demon hunter powers and finding no abnormalities, he deliberately pretended to be deceived, and directly permitted the youth named Derek Berg to return home. However, he had secretly sent someone to monitor the situation closely. This was completely different from the detention and observation method, which Colin had used in the past. It was a change he had no choice but to make. The black shadow that was slightly gyrating replied. After he entered the room, he sat on the edge of the bed and muttered to himself for quite a while. As I was afraid that the mysterious man would discover me, I didn't get too close, so I couldn't clearly hear what was being said. However, I can confirm that this is an abnormal sign. After talking to himself, Derek seemed to become very tired and fell asleep very quickly. But after a short nap, he suddenly woke up and conducted a ritual. I suspect that his mind wasn't lucid while doing so and that he was controlled by the mysterious man. By the way, the ritual had elements of a secret deed. Colin pondered for a while and said with a solemn expression, as expected, perhaps he was communicating with his main body via this method. What exactly is his purpose? Why did he spend his 42 years at the bottom of the spire in peace? The black shadow naturally couldn't answer this question as it continued. After the ritual, Derek no longer showed any abnormal behavior. Does this matter need to be dealt with immediately? If that mysterious person's main body is attracted here, we might not be able to deal with it. Colin remained silent for a few seconds before saying, "Continue the observation. That mysterious person has yet to show any substantial malice, so our reaction can't be too intense." Sai, do you remember that prophecy? It's almost time for disaster to befall. The further we explore, the more strange ruins we find, and the more dangerous the items we harvest. By your will, Your Excellency. The black shadow slowly retreated back into the ground and disappeared. At this moment in the Berg household, Derek began to cough so violently that his heart seemed to almost burst. Cough, cough, cough. He crouched down and coughed nonstop until his throat began to itch, and he coughed out something. Splat. A translucent object slid across his throat and fell to the ground. It was a worm with the length and thickness of a finger. There were some transparent areas on its body, forming rings. Derek had seen something like this at the bottom of the spire previously, and he was certain that he was already free of Ammon's influence. He bent down and picked up the translucent worm, and finally, he was able to count the total number of rings on its body. There were a total of 12. What is its use? What can it be used for? It seems to be dead. Derek lost himself in thought. Winter County, in the northern part of the Lone Kingdom. A black Gothic cathedral towered over the snow-covered mountains as it occupied a vast stretch of land. In front of it was a cliff, and its surroundings was a vast expanse of whiteness with utmost silence. This was the church of the Evernight goddess's headquarters, known as the Cathedral of Serenity. The dark-haired, green-eyed Leonard Mitchell had a black windbreaker draped over him as he wore red gloves and walked out of his room. Having successfully advanced and stabilized himself, he hadn't been given the opportunity to participate in any operations yet, as well as some exercises and so-called mysticism courses. After going around a corner, Leonard saw a staircase leading down. There he saw Captain Dunn Smith, with a pair of dark gray eyes and dressed in a black windbreaker, and Klein Morty, who exuded a bookish demeanor, standing there, smiling and waiting. He tilted his head back and sighed. My memory has also gotten worse. I've already forgotten that the two of you no longer exist. Leonard looked away and walked down the stairs to the first floor of the cathedral. He knocked on the door and entered a small room. There were chairs in the room, and some nighthawks wearing red gloves sat around inside. Leonard found a seat at random and sat down, smiling as he chatted with his friend. After a while, the high-ranking deacon, Crestet Sesamir, with his propped-up collar covering his chin and lips, walked in, sat right in front, and said to the crowd, "Today's class will inform you of things you need to pay attention to. As Red Gloves, you will travel to different places, and there's a high chance of encountering dangerous high-sequence Beyonders. If their intent is obvious, and they want to kill you, the only thing you can do is leave a trail behind you so that the subsequent investigators will be able to find the appropriate clue. The exact methods include, but most of the time, high-sequence Beyonders won't always attack you directly. They will utilize you based on all sorts of factors. You must be alert enough to not be fooled, and here are a few things that we have summarized." Sitting in the back, Leonard listened with a smile and great attentiveness. His target for revenge was a high-sequence Beyonder. Sesamir paused for 2 seconds and continued. In the first case, some high-sequence Beyonder will pretend to be hidden existences, using promises and hope to deceive you into reciting his corresponding description. In the second case, some high-sequence Beyonders might be restrained in a sealed state. They will act as mystical items that can help you get out of your predicament. For example, a magic lamp that can grant you 3 wishes or a wishing pond. The third case is for a high-sequence potion named Parasite. They often claim that they have lost their bodies and can only survive together with your spirit body. They can only rely on you and will not harm you. They will then give you knowledge, formulas, and all sorts of benefits, hoping that you can become powerful so that you can one day help him reconstruct his body or take revenge. In reality, the Beyonders with parasites will only become nutrients for the parasite, thus prolonging the parasite's lifespan and condition. As Leonard listened, his smile faded. Unique hobby, the Cathedral of Serenity looked particularly beautiful at night. It complemented with the crimson moon, high up in the sky that coldly illuminated the land. Leonard entered his single room, took off his 2 red gloves, and tossed them onto a wooden table. With a grim look, he sat in front of the patterned glass window, his back facing out as he bathed in the moonlight. After 10 seconds of silence, he said softly, almost gritting his teeth, "So you're a parasite." Leonard's voice echoed faintly in his own ears, muffled by obvious anger, tension, a sense of loss and fear. In the blink of an eye, a slightly aged voice resounded in his mind. "You can say that. What exactly do you want? Are you a being that's leeching my life through your parasitic means? Or are you waiting for me to become stronger, so you can directly devour my Beyonder characteristic, just like cultivating a humanoid potion?" Leonard's voice was suppressed, but in no way slow. The slightly aged voice in his mind laughed. "Team, your fortuitous encounter, didn't you always think so? You believe yourself to be unique and the protagonist of this era. In fact, you aren't acting as arrogant and self-conceited as you usually do. Ultimately, you're wary of me. Hee. After I taught you the acting method, you didn't even focus on studying it. All you did was a very superficial attempt at it. You wasted a very long time before you digested it and even hid it. You didn't pursue the nightmare potion. TT was only after you met with the spawn of the true creator, and suffered a setback. Were you willing to advance to sequence 7? Your regret has made you hallucinate. Leonard, think about it carefully. Would I not understand the Church of the Evernight Goddess? When I dealt with them, even the so-called Channies hadn't even been born yet. Would I not know that the Church of the Evernight Goddess knows of parasite? Would I not realize that the Red Gloves would grasp certain secrets to prevent the infiltration of high-sequence Beyonder? But did I ever stop you from joining the Red Gloves? After a few brief changes in expression, Leonard finally fell silent, saying nothing. The voice in his mind laughed again. You feel like you have aged faster than your real age. No, right. I can live for at least another 100 years. I'm not in a hurry to take over my host's life. As for your Beyonder characteristics, Humph, we aren't even in a similar pathway that allows exchanging. If I swallow it, it would be equivalent to drinking poison, making me half crazy and increasing my chance of losing control. Do you think that I would do that? Evernight is grouped with Giant and Death, while my Beyonder pathway's goal is that of the Apprentice and Seer. Leonard looked at his body, which was illuminated by the crimson moonlight. After some thought, he asked again, what exactly do you want to do? What is your purpose? The slightly aged voice in his mind sighed. Didn't I already tell you? TVE suffered tremendous damage, and I need a host to recover slowly, and I have to hide from a terrible enemy. The Nighthawks, the Church of the Evernight Goddess, is quite a good choice for a host. Leonard lifted his head, looked at the ceiling for a few seconds, and said in a deep voice, will you be discovered by the archbishops, high-ranking deacons, or other sealed artifacts? The slightly aged voice replied leisurely, if parasites were so easily discovered, that high-ranking deacon named Sesamir wouldn't have just given a warning and not send all of you to be checked. Of course, parasites do leave traces. The Church of the Evernight Goddess has the means to determine this, but it's relatively complicated and troublesome. It will cause certain losses and substantial danger. It might even affect that goddess, so before you become a high-ranking deacon, making you qualified to participate in meetings for the upper echelons of the church and interact with Grade 0 sealed artifacts, there's no need to worry. By then, I should have recovered and embarked on my own journey. Leonard listened with a serious expression. After a while he said, you have a terrifying enemy. Who is he? The slightly aged voice chuckled and said, I don't know his name, but I do know his last name. What is it? Leonard asked. The slightly aged voice suddenly became low and deep. Ammon, the area south of the bridge, 46 River Bay Avenue. The owners of the house that were enjoying their dinner heard the tinkling of the doorbell. The only maid came to the door, and through the peephole above the door's lock, she saw a policeman in a black and white checkered uniform. She opened the door and asked somewhat fearfully, Sir, is there anything I can do for you? The cop was none other than the disguised Klein, who was attempting to take the initiative to perform. He was here to confirm that the partners of the vampire, Emlyn White, the ones living at 48 River Bay Avenue, and the people who entrusted Stewart with the mission, were law-abiding monsters. Yes, law-abiding monsters. Although this doesn't sound right and sounds a little funny, it's how I would react with my true thoughts, Klein emphasized in his heart. The police uniform he wore wasn't a fake that he specially tailored. It was a product of his ordinary clothes and hallucinatory effects. A magician had to do what a magician would do. Klein didn't monitor 48 River Bay Avenue because he believed that Emlyn White's companions had long since moved away. As monsters and non-humans, moving to another residence was the most basic thing to do after a comrade disappears for several days. They had to suspect that Emlyn White was captured by the Nighthawks, the mandated Punishers, or other official Beyonder organizations, and it was necessary to assume that he might be dead at any moment. Therefore, what Klein wanted to do was to perform an investigation by conducting a survey. He maintained the arrogance of a low-ranking policeman towards an ordinary citizen. Without taking off his hat, he slightly raised his chin and said, I have something to ask your master. The maid entered in a fluster and quickly brought back a man in his 30s wearing a thick shirt. Officer, what would you like to ask me? The man asked nervously. Klein stood at the door and looked inside. Do you know the residents of Unit 48? Do. The male owner was stunned for a moment before asking, what happened to them? They're involved in a case. You have to tell me everything you know, Klein said with a straight face. His face was also disguised, augmented with slight hallucinatory effect. It was to ensure that he looked distinct from the great detective Sherlock Moriarty. The male owner suddenly came to a realization. It's no wonder they moved away so hurriedly more than a month ago. Most of the residents of River Bay Avenue and the neighborhood knew the Whites and their son. He was a handsome but eccentric young man. Mr. White is an excellent physician and is good at using all kinds of medicine and bloodletting therapy. Bloodletting therapy? Klein returned with a question. Yes, although this has been regarded by many newspapers and magazines as an old medical skill that had no effect, anyone who received Mr. White's treatment were cured. However, Mr. White also said that except for him, the other doctors who practice bloodletting therapy are quacks. The owner gave his viewpoint. The bloodletting therapy is to accumulate food for themselves, isn't it? The only thing that is useful was the medicine. This vampire family relied on bloodletting therapy to help treat patients while receiving food as compensation. If there weren't many patients, or if their blood was very unhealthy, would they consider going to a distant hospital to steal blood from a blood bag and drink it? For such monsters, they really are law-abiding. Klein nodded in understanding. The emotional color changes in his spirit vision told him that the man wasn't lying. Seeing that the police officer didn't refute him, the man continued, Mr. White and his wife are very nice people. Although they can't cure those who are seriously ill, they're still pretty good doctors for all the residents who live nearby. Was their child, Emlyn, involved in a case? That young man was too silent, as though he looked down on us. He's always hiding at home, and I have no idea what he's doing. Officer, are you hot? It's so cold outside. He probably just hides in the day and comes out at night. Klein wiped the sweat off his forehead and said, I've been walking around here all day because of this case. Next, according to his design survey, he learned everything about the Whites and their son. One family at a time, he knocked on the door, asked questions, compiled answers, and came to the conclusion that the White family was indeed kind, amiable, and law-abiding. It doesn't seem like a description of a vampire. Klein looked up at the crimson moon which was piercing through the clouds, ready to make a final confirmation. He removed the hallucinatory effect from his body and started divining. After making sure there was no danger, he went around to the side and climbed into the house at 48 River Bay Avenue. Others might not know who had taken Emlyn White away, ultimately afraid of being followed up by an official visit from official Bayonders, but Klein knew what was going on and wasn't worried about a trap. As he entered the second floor, he used the moonlight to see that the rooms were in disarray. Many things hadn't been taken away. Through these things, he could imagine the haste in which their owners had left. He even found some precious books on herbs in a study, including some popular countryside folk recipes. As he walked, Klein entered one of the bedrooms, and shadows came into view. He jumped in fright, imagining that he had been ambushed. He almost snapped his fingers to light the match that had been thrown outside. Fortunately, no attacks occurred. The crimson moonlight shone through the window, covering the entire room. Klein was finally able to clearly see what those black shadows were. They didn't have any spiritual luster, and they were figurines of varying sizes. The biggest one was only slightly shorter than Klein. It was a girl wearing a gorgeous long skirt. Her sleeves and collars were covered with lace and ribbon. This female figurine was obviously more like one of wax. Her facial features were vivid and lifelike, and her golden hair and red eyes were alluring and beautiful. The smallest one was only the size of a normal person's palm. It was a woman wearing silver body armor. She looked valiant and heroic while looking magnanimous and beautiful. As his eyes swept past each figurine, Klein suddenly remembered something. Under the influence of Roselle, the development of figurine art had two trends. One was the adorable type, allowing them to have a change of clothes, while the other strove to be more realistic. Klein looked around and couldn't help but exclaim, these figurines are not cheap. Don't tell me Emlyn is a vampire who is obsessed with figurines.